What would you do if someone spat in your face, on purpose, while you stood frozen, unable to react? At Buckingham Palace, under the scorching August sun, a wealthy American tourist crossed a line no one dared before. But what happened next didn't end with a fight. It ended with a lesson that left millions speechless. This isn't just a story about disrespect. This is about honor. This is about restraint. And this is about the moment the world learned that silence doesn't mean weakness. If you believe true strength lies in dignity, not outrage, make sure to hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more real-life lessons in courage, discipline, and respect. Tap the bell so you'll never miss another powerful story like this again. Buckingham Palace stood in all its regal splendor, bathed in the unforgiving blaze of the August sun. Tourists packed the gates, buzzing with excitement, their smartphones held high like digital torches, eager to capture a piece of royal history. Amid the sea of eager faces and fluttering Union Jacks stood one man, Guard Caleb Whitmore. He was a statue in crimson, immaculate in every detail. The polished buttons of his uniform gleamed, his posture unbreakable, eyes fixed forward with the focus of a trained soldier. At only 27, Caleb had already seen more than most men twice his age. 8 years in the British Army had hardened him, shaped him, molded him into the quiet symbol of strength that now stood watch over one of the world's most iconic landmarks. But Caleb wasn't always a Queen's Guard. Before the spotless boots and centuries-old tradition, there were dusty deserts and bullets whizzing past his ears. 2 tours in Afghanistan had earned him scars, medals, and a deep understanding of what true discipline meant. That discipline was the invisible shield he carried with him now, each day as he rose before dawn and devoted hours to preparing his ceremonial uniform. Every crease a reflection of the soldiers who came before him. To the average tourist, these guards were nothing more than a photo op, stoic men in funny hats. But to Caleb, the uniform was sacred. "When we put this on," he'd once said to a young cadet, "we become part of something bigger than ourselves. It's not just standing still, it's standing for something." Most days at the palace were a blur of laughter, excited chatter, and the occasional misguided attempt to make the guards flinch. Caleb had grown used to it. He'd become a master at tuning out the noise, breathing in the history embedded in the stones beneath his feet. But not every day was predictable. Some days tested more than muscle memory. Some days tested the soul. This Thursday was one of them. It was 2:30 p.m., the heat peaking as the crowd swelled. A group of American tourists approached the post, led by a man whose loud laugh and designer clothes announced him long before he spoke. Mason Langford, 26, from Houston, Texas, exuded arrogance the way others exuded sweat. His family's oil fortune had cushioned every fall, inflated every ego trip, and today it had brought him to Buckingham Palace. Drunk on scotch, self-importance, and a thrill of public attention, Langford was the kind of man who never heard the word no. Back home, waiters catered to him before he even sat down. Executives twice his age deferred to his opinion simply because of his last name. But here, in front of Caleb Whitmore, Mason found himself ignored, and it made him itch. "Bet I can make this robot crack," he said to his 3 friends, all of whom already had their phones recording. Their laughter was sharp and rehearsed, the kind that sought approval, not amusement. Caleb didn't move. His breathing slowed as he felt the air shift, sensed the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward him. He'd been trained to endure much worse. Sandstorms, shelling, the cries of wounded friends in a foreign land. But today wasn't about surviving enemy fire. It was about holding the line, of decorum, of tradition, of self-control. Mason strutted forward like he owned the cobblestone under his feet. "Come on, man, give us a smile," he sneered, throwing a mock salute as his friends chuckled. Caleb stood firm. Inside, he called upon the same focus he'd used while holding a position for hours under enemy fire. This, by comparison, was a mild test. At least for now. But Mason wasn't finished. His performance intensified, fueled by the growing crowd and the heat rising from both the pavement and his ego. He circled Caleb like a predator, making mocking comments about the uniform, the traditions, even the monarchy itself. Still, Caleb didn't budge. The tension became palpable, an invisible thread pulling tighter with every insult. A nearby vendor packed up his cart in silence, sensing something wrong. A mother clutched her child closer. One or two tourists lowered their phones, beginning to feel uneasy. What they didn't know was that Caleb noticed everything. The slurred edge of Mason's voice, the shaking hand hovering near his bearskin cap, the desperation in his smirk. Years of combat had taught Caleb that danger rarely screamed. It crept. And in that moment, as the sun burned down and the air held its breath, Caleb knew something was coming. Something that would test him in a way the battlefield never had. Mason Langford wasn't used to being ignored. He stood just inches from Caleb Whitmore, his sweat-drenched polo clinging to his back, a smirk playing at his lips. Behind him, his three friends laughed nervously, their phones still recording, hoping for a reaction. Something viral. But Caleb didn't move. That silence? It wasn't weakness. It was strength. Crafted from war zones, from years of standing watch, in heat, rain, snow, and mockery. But Mason didn't understand that. He mistook stillness for submission. "You seriously just gonna stand there, man?" Mason taunted. "Is that all you got?" He waved his hand in front of Caleb's face, the scent of overpriced scotch wafting through the air. The guard's jaw clenched just barely, a subtle tick only visible to a trained observer. But Mason wasn't observant. He was drunk. Drunk on alcohol, on ego, on the illusion that money gave him control over everything. The crowd was swelling now. Some tourists began backing away, sensing the energy shift. An elderly couple frowned in disgust. A group of schoolchildren watched wide-eyed, clinging to their teachers' arms. The laughter from earlier was thinning, replaced by tension thick enough to choke. One voice broke through. A British woman, probably in her 60s, called out, "Show some respect, lad. That man's doing his duty." But Mason grinned wider, as if the woman had just handed him a bigger stage. "Duty?" he mocked, turning to the crowd. "Standing like a mannequin all day is duty?" He flung his arms open dramatically, soaking up the attention. His sunglasses hung crooked on his collar, his hair tousled from the wind and sweat. "My tax dollars pay for this whole charade," he shouted. It was an absurd statement. He wasn't even British. But accuracy wasn't his goal. Dominance was. He needed to feel bigger. And for that, Caleb had become his target. Still, Caleb stood motionless. He could feel his heartbeat slow, his mind entering a space carved out long ago in the chaos of war. Observe. Breathe. Control. He clocked the tremble in Mason's left hand, the nervous shuffle of his friend on the left, the slight nod one gave to another, as if they had a plan. Then Mason crossed the invisible line. He leaned in close, closer than anyone ever should. His lips curled, his chest heaved, and without warning, he spat. A glob of spit landed just below Caleb's right eye, sliding slowly down his cheek like a mocking tear. Gasps echoed through the crowd. A child screamed. Even the birds seemed to fall silent. The spitting wasn't just disrespect. It was desecration. Mason stood proudly, the grin never leaving his face. He expected rage, a shove, maybe even a punch, something to finally break the guard's composure. Instead, Caleb did nothing. Not a twitch, not a blink. The spit dripped slowly to his collar, absorbed into the scarlet fabric of his uniform. And yet, the entire courtyard held its breath. Then, a sound. Boots. Heavy, synchronized. The guard captain, accompanied by 2 more guards, was approaching fast. Their presence alone shifted the atmosphere. Mason's grin wavered. From a distance, a pair of palace security officers moved toward the scene, radios crackling. One of Mason's friends lowered his phone and muttered, "Bro, What did you just do? Mason took a small step back. Reality was catching up to him, dragging behind it the weight of consequence. He opened his mouth, maybe to joke, maybe to justify, but it was too late. The guard captain stopped before Caleb, his expression unreadable. "Guard Whitmore," he said firmly, "stand down." Caleb's entire body shifted, slowly, with precision, with purpose. He turned, came to attention, and saluted with flawless execution. "Sir," Caleb said, voice low but steady. "Permission to address the situation." The captain gave a single nod. And for the first time in 8 hours, Caleb Whitmore broke his silence. With his white-gloved hand, he reached up and wiped the spit from his cheek. His movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. Then he stepped forward, not toward violence, but truth. "I took an oath," he began, his voice clear, carrying through the courtyard like a command. "Not just to wear this uniform, but to stand for what it means. Honor, duty, sacrifice." Mason's smirk evaporated. Caleb's eyes locked on him. "While you were drinking your courage into a glass, I was standing guard over values older than either of us. This uniform isn't a costume. It's a legacy." The crowd was silent now. Even the security officers stopped mid-step. "You think silence is weakness," Caleb continued, "but real strength, real power, is knowing you could strike back and choosing not to." Mason looked down, unable to hold his gaze. "You came for a show. You got one, but not the kind you expected." Then Caleb turned to the crowd. "And if there's anything worth remembering today, let it be this: dignity doesn't flinch, not even when it's spat on." The moment Caleb Whitmore's voice echoed through the crowd, everything changed. Tourists who had been laughing seconds earlier now stood frozen, their phones lowered slightly, not wanting to miss a single word. The tension that had once felt uncomfortable had transformed into awe. And yet, the most unexpected part of the entire confrontation was still to come. As Caleb stepped back into formation, a strange stillness blanketed the courtyard. Calm before a second storm. Mason Langford, who had moments ago paraded around like a king among jesters, now looked unsure of himself. His face had lost its color, his confidence evaporating under the harsh light of accountability. But alcohol has a cruel way of distorting judgment, and Mason wasn't ready to surrender the spotlight just yet. He glanced around. The crowd's mood had shifted, but they were still watching, still recording. And somewhere, deep in his ego, a dangerous thought took root. This wasn't over. Mason took a shaky breath and forced a laugh. "Well," he said loudly, "you should put that speech on a t-shirt. Bet you'd sell a ton of them." No one laughed. His voice sounded hollow against the stone walls of Buckingham Palace. Behind him, one of his friends stepped back, clearly wanting no part in what might come next. The others avoided eye contact altogether, gripping their phones like shields. Mason looked back at Caleb. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. "You think you're better than me, huh? Standing there with your shiny buttons, pretending you're something special?" Caleb didn't move, but his silence now carried more weight than 100 words. Mason's lips curled. The scotch was back in control, mixing with a growing bitterness. He stepped forward again, too close. And then, he did the unthinkable. With a sudden, violent motion, he snatched the bearskin cap from Caleb's head. Gasps exploded around the courtyard like a firecracker. One woman screamed. A nearby vendor dropped the soda can in his hand. Caleb didn't flinch, but his eyes followed the cap as Mason held it above his head like a trophy. "Look at me," Mason shouted. "Now I'm the Royal Guard." It was a surreal, almost cartoonish display, except there was nothing funny about it. Palace security was already sprinting forward. The guard captain shouted an order, but Mason didn't hear them. Or maybe he didn't care. His moment of triumph had blinded him completely. "Go ahead," he barked at Caleb. "Try and take it back." And then Caleb moved. For the first time since taking his post that morning, he took one full, deliberate step forward. The silence shattered. It wasn't a lunge. It wasn't aggression. It was authority made visible. Mason flinched. "Drop it," Caleb said, voice calm but firm, steel wrapped in velvet. Something in his tone, quiet but filled with command, pierced through Mason's drunken haze. The crowd could feel it too. It was no longer a battle between two men. It was a clash between ignorance and history, arrogance and purpose. Mason hesitated. He looked at the cap in his hand, then at Caleb, and for a moment, he faltered. But before he could decide, two officers arrived, grabbing him by both arms. The bearskin cap tumbled from his hand and hit the ground with a soft thud, followed by the heavy sound of reality crashing down. "You've gone far enough, sir," one officer said as he pulled Mason backward. "You're under arrest," the other added. "You've assaulted a Queen's Guard and interfered with royal security protocol." Mason opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. Only silence and the weight of 100 eyes staring back at him. His friends slowly backed away, their phones finally lowered. Whatever fame they had hoped for now looked more like a public trial, and they wanted no part of it. As the officers began escorting Mason away, Caleb knelt with reverence and retrieved his bearskin cap, brushing it clean with his gloved hand before placing it back on his head with ceremonial precision. The moment was sacred. A little girl nearby whispered to her father, "Is he okay?" Her voice was soft, unsure. Her father nodded, eyes never leaving Caleb. "He's more than okay. He's what every man should be." The guard captain stepped beside Caleb and offered a brief nod of respect, more emotion than usually permitted in uniform. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Back in the crowd, an elderly man removed his hat, his voice cracked with emotion. "My brother died in Korea. He would have been proud to see this." Across the courtyard, people were crying quietly, not because someone was punished, but because something rare had just occurred. A moment where dignity, triumph head over humiliation. And as Mason disappeared through the gates, his voice no longer loud, no longer proud, Caleb returned to his position. Unshaken, vacant, and unforgettable. Mason Langford sat in the back of the police van, hands cuffed loosely in front of him, eyes staring blankly out the barred window. His hair was tousled, his sunglasses gone, and the pride that once fueled his swagger had melted away into something unfamiliar. Silence. For the first time in years, Mason didn't have anything to say. Just hours ago, he had strutted through central London like a prince. Champagne breakfast, private tours, designer shopping, a buzz of confidence humming beneath his skin. He had everything, or at least, he thought he did. Now, that illusion was crumbling. The police officer sitting beside him didn't speak. He didn't need to. The quiet inside the van was louder than any lecture. Mason's hands, still red from where the officers had restrained him, trembled slightly. He remembered snatching the guard's bearskin cap. He remembered the laughter, his own and that of his friends. He remembered the spit, the cameras, the smug satisfaction of being in control. But most of all, he remembered Caleb Whitmore's voice. It echoed through his mind like a song he couldn't shake. You think silence is weakness, but real strength, real power, is knowing you could strike back and choosing not to. That line hit harder than any punch could. It wasn't angry, it wasn't defensive. It was firm, grounded, honest. And it came from a place Mason didn't understand, but suddenly, desperately wanted to. He had tried to humiliate someone for the sake of entertainment. But instead, he'd exposed himself, his ignorance, his privilege, and the fragile ego he tried to protect with bravado. He leaned his head back against the cold metal wall and closed his eyes. Hours later, Mason sat alone on a bench in the station's holding room. The initial adrenaline had faded, leaving only the bitter sting of humiliation. A half-full water bottle sat beside him, untouched. His friends had disappeared, their loyalty as thin as their laughter had been. A plainclothes officer entered quietly, holding a folder and a clipboard. "Mr. Langford," the man said, calm but direct. "We've contacted your embassy. You're free to return to your hotel for now. Charges are pending. There will be a hearing." Mason nodded slowly. The officer didn't move. He studied him for a moment, then said, "For what it's worth, I've worked this job 20 years, seen all kinds of idiots trying to make the guards crack, but I've never seen one answer the way that man did." Mason said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. Back at his hotel, Mason sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the marble floor. He didn't touch the minibar, didn't scroll through his phone. The notifications had stopped. The fun was over. He opened his laptop almost out of instinct and searched for the video. There it was, "Respect the Guard," already with millions of views, multiple camera angles, comments pouring in. It wasn't his prank that people were talking about. It was Caleb's response, his composure, his words. One comment, pinned to the top, read, "This man stood still under enemy fire and still chose grace over rage when spat on." That's what strength looks like. Mason watched the video from beginning to end. This time, he saw it all differently. He noticed the veteran in the crowd with the RAF pin, the little girl asking her mom why the man was being mean. The way Caleb's eyes never wavered, even after the ultimate insult. He saw not just a man in uniform, but a symbol, a protector of something intangible, something sacred. And for the first time in his life, Mason felt ashamed. Not because he was caught, not because of the legal consequences, but because he had stood in front of a man who embodied everything he wasn't, and he had tried to tear it down. He thought about the guard's words again. This uniform isn't a costume, it's a legacy. Mason reached for the hotel notepad. He wasn't sure why. His hand hovered over the paper, unsure what to write. Then, almost without thinking, he scribbled 2 words. "I'm sorry." He stared at them, unsure what to do next. He couldn't erase the past, couldn't take back the moment the spit left his mouth, but maybe, just maybe, he could start to understand what it meant to truly respect something bigger than himself. Maybe that moment, as humiliating as it was the beginning of something different. Not the end of his story, but the start of a new chapter. 3 weeks had passed since Mason Langford's disgraceful encounter at Buckingham Palace, yet the incident refused to fade. His face had become a meme, his name a trending hashtag. Every corner of the internet had its opinion. Some mocked, many condemned, but a surprising number used it to teach. Mason had gone silent. No interviews, no public statements, just a carefully crafted message from his family's PR firm citing deep regret and a personal journey of reflection. But what the world didn't know was that Mason, behind closed doors, was changing. It began not with punishment, but with a proposal. After reviewing the charges, the magistrate overseeing his case issued a conditional judgment. "You can pay your fines and disappear into a yacht," she had said, her eyes steady. "Or you can do something different. Something that might actually matter." Mason chose the second option. And that's how he found himself on a cloudy Monday morning in the lobby of St. George's Veterans Center in South London. No cameras, no security detail, just him, a clipboard, and a nervous energy that clung to his suit like sweat. He didn't wear designer clothes that day. No sunglasses, no bravado, just jeans, a plain shirt, and quiet footsteps. He had been assigned 100 hours of community service, assisting veterans with daily support tasks, meals, transportation, paperwork, companionship. At first, the staff treated him with cold professionalism. They knew who he was. They had seen the video. No one said it, but he felt it in every glance, every awkward silence. His first day, he was tasked with organizing donated clothing in the storage room. Alone. By the second day, he was helping in the kitchen, peeling potatoes beside a retired Royal Navy cook who didn't speak more than 2 words to him until lunch break. "Didn't think you'd show up again," the man finally muttered, handing Mason a cup of tea. "Didn't think I would either," Mason replied honestly. The man cracked a smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the days passed, Mason began to listen, not just to instructions, but to stories. He met men and women who had served across decades and continents, some bearing physical scars, others invisible ones. They didn't flaunt their service. They didn't demand recognition. They just lived, day by day, with quiet resilience. One afternoon, while helping install new shelving, Mason worked beside a tall man with weathered hands and a prosthetic leg. The name on his clipboard read Whitmore, Caleb. Mason froze. Caleb looked up, recognition flickering in his eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't frown, just nodded once. Mason's throat tightened. He started, but Caleb raised a hand. I know who you are, Caleb said calmly. But I'm not here for apologies. I'm here for shelves. Mason nodded slowly. Right, shelves. They worked in silence. The sound of drilling filled the room, but Mason's mind screamed with unspoken words. Finally, unable to hold it in, he said, You didn't have to speak that day. You could have just let the officers handle it. Caleb paused mid-turn, then resumed his task. Could have, but some moments call for more than silence. Mason looked at him. You changed me. Caleb didn't respond at first. Then he said, Good, but that's not my job. That's yours now. Those words stuck. From that moment on, Mason showed up differently. He wasn't just serving hours. He was learning, growing, changing. He helped an elderly man write a letter to his granddaughter. He drove a veteran to a memorial service. He sat for an hour with a woman who had lost both her sons in combat, saying nothing, just listening. One afternoon, a staff member handed him a small stack of envelopes. Letters from students, she said. They're writing about respect after watching that video. Thought you might want to see. Mason read them all. One in particular stood out. Dear Mr. Langford, at first I thought you were a bad guy, but then I learned that sometimes people mess up before they learn what matters. My granddad was a soldier. He said anyone who learns from mistakes is worth respecting. Sincerely, Amelia, age 10. He folded the letter and kept it in his wallet. Not to forget what he did, but to remember what he became because of it. By the end of his hours, Mason didn't ask for a certificate or a statement to clear his name. He didn't post about it. Instead, he asked if he could stay on as a volunteer. The supervisor looked surprised. You not done punishing yourself? She asked. Mason smiled softly. No, I'm done pretending I was ever above learning. It was a rainy afternoon in late October when Mason Langford returned to St. George's Veterans Center, not as a man completing community service, but as someone who now belonged. He no longer counted his hours. He didn't look at the clock. He arrived early, stayed late, and took pride in doing the unglamorous things, organizing the pantry, scrubbing dishes, pushing wheelchairs through damp corridors. And most surprisingly, he found peace in it. For the first time in years, his presence wasn't tied to status or expectation. No one cared about his last name or his bank account. What mattered here was consistency, compassion, and showing up, even when no one's watching. One Thursday morning, he was sorting donated books when Caleb Whitmore entered the room, rain clinging to the edge of his overcoat. He carried a file under one arm and a quiet sense of purpose, like always. They had spoken only a handful of times since the shelving day, brief exchanges, nothing more. Mason had never pressed. Caleb wasn't the type to force familiarity, and Mason had learned the value of silence. But today felt different. Got a minute? Caleb asked. Mason nodded. Of course. They sat at the corner table, where a kettle steamed quietly behind them. Caleb slid the file forward. These are mentorship applications, he explained. We're expanding a new veteran outreach program, pairing transitioning servicemen with civilians in leadership training. I think you might be a good fit. Mason blinked. Me? You've changed, Caleb said simply. Mason looked down, uneasy. You mean I'm not the spoiled kid who spat on a Queen's Guard anymore? Caleb's gaze didn't flinch. That moment was ugly, but who you are after it, that's what counts. People talk about strength like it's loud, but I've seen the real kind. It's quiet, It's in how you carry regret and how you choose to rise from it. Mason's throat tightened. He hadn't expected this. He still carried shame tucked deep into the corners of his chest, but hearing this from the man he had humiliated, it cracked something open. He reached for the file. "I'll do it," he said. Weeks passed. Mason began shadowing Caleb during small group sessions with new veterans. At first, he sat quietly, taking notes, unsure of his place. But gradually, he spoke up, sharing not war stories, but failures, regret, growth. To his surprise, the vets listened. Not because he'd earned stripes in combat, but because he owned his mistakes. One evening, after a particularly raw session, a young ex-soldier named Aaron approached him. "I watched your video," Aaron said. "At first I hated you. Thought you were everything wrong with the world." Mason nodded. "I was." Aaron paused. "Yeah, maybe. But then you came back. You didn't hide. That takes guts too, you know." Mason didn't reply. He just extended a hand. Aaron shook it firmly. From that moment, Mason stopped avoiding his past. He used it. He told the truth, not for applause, but as proof that change was possible. He returned to schools where kids had written letters. He read Amelia's aloud, the one from the 10-year-old who believed in second chances. He spoke to classrooms about respect, not from a pedestal, but from the dirt he had once stood in. One day, during a small speaking engagement, a parent asked, "Do you regret it?" Mason paused. "Yes," he said, "but not because I got caught. I regret that I ever believed strength came from proving myself louder than someone else. Now I know strength is standing beside people, not above them." The room was silent. Then came applause, not wild but warm, honest. Afterward, Caleb approached him. "You've found your voice," he said. Mason smiled. "I borrowed yours for a while." Caleb chuckled softly. "Just give it back stronger." They stood there a moment, not as guard and intruder, but as equals. Months later, Mason walked past Buckingham Palace, not for a photo, not for nostalgia, but as a quiet observer. The guards stood at attention, still as statues, dignified as ever. Tourists milled about, taking selfies, whispering to each other. But Mason noticed something different. There was more distance now, more reverence. Parents kneeling to explain the guards' roles, children waving respectfully instead of mocking. Something had shifted. A ripple, a legacy. He didn't take a photo, he didn't post anything. He simply stood, hand in pocket, heart beating slower. A boy nearby looked up and said, "Dad, is that the guy from the video?" Mason turned. The father smiled. "Yes, and he's the reason we're talking about what respect really means." Mason gave the boy a nod, and then he walked on. Quietly, confidently, changed. Spring had come early to London. The morning sun filtered through soft clouds, warming the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace. Tourists gathered, as always, with phones poised, voices excited, laughter bubbling through the air. But there was something different now, an undercurrent of reverence, subtle yet unmistakable. Among the visitors was Mason Langford, dressed plainly in a gray coat, his hands in his pockets, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. No one recognized him. Not anymore. And that was just the way he wanted it. He had come not to relive the past, but to witness a ceremony that meant more to him than any gala, any award, or luxury trip. Today, Caleb Whitmore was retiring from his ceremonial post. After 10 years of service, 8 in active military duty, 2 standing watch over tradition and honor, Caleb would step down, but his legacy would remain. A ripple that began with a single moment of restraint had grown into a movement of respect. Videos of Caleb's speech had made their way into classrooms, leadership training sessions, even military boot camps around the world. But he never let the attention change him. While others debated online, Caleb kept showing up. Polished boots, measured breaths, silent strength. Mason remembered that silence. He remembered the spit on the guard's cheek, the weight of his own arrogance, and the moment he realized he'd made a fool of himself, not just in front of a crowd, but in front of history. And now, he was standing here, on the other side of it all. A soft cheer rose from the crowd as the changing of the guard began. The ceremony was flawless, like always. Every synchronized step, every polished buckle, a tribute to something deeper than pageantry, discipline, sacrifice, legacy. When Caleb appeared in formation, Mason felt his chest tighten. The man hadn't changed much. Still sharp, still composed, but there was a deeper calm now. A peace earned, not given. Mason caught his eyes just for a moment, and though Caleb didn't break character, his gaze softened, just enough. Mason smiled. After the ceremony, as the guards exited the square, Mason stepped back into the quiet corners of the palace courtyard. He had no intention of interrupting, but then he heard a voice behind him. "Didn't think I'd see you here." He turned. Caleb approached, dressed down now in a tailored navy suit. No bearskin cap, no rifle, just a man, one who had lived 1,000 stories behind stoic eyes. "You clean up well," Mason said with a grin. "So do you," Caleb replied, extending a hand. They shook like old friends, not because they shared history, but because they shared growth. "You still volunteering?" Caleb asked. "Every Thursday," Mason said. "And I'm helping lead that mentorship program. We're working with schools now, talking to students about leadership, self-awareness, humility." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Humility? Imagine that." Mason laughed. "You wouldn't believe how much I've learned from 12-year-olds. "Those are the best teachers," Caleb replied. There was a pause, the kind only people who've truly forgiven can share. "You ever regret how it all happened?" Mason asked finally. Caleb took a breath, then shook his head. "No, because it gave us a chance to do something bigger than ourselves. That moment didn't break either of us. It revealed us, and then gave us a choice." Mason nodded. "I made the wrong one that day, but you've been making the right one since." That meant more than any apology ever could. They stood in silence for a few moments, watching the tourists disperse. A little girl posed in front of the gates, holding her father's hand. A boy tried to mimic the guard's posture, standing tall with a puffed chest. "What now?" Mason asked. Caleb smiled. "Rest, maybe, write, maybe teach a bit, but mostly I want to be present. After a decade of standing still, I think it's time to move forward." "I like that," Mason said. "Moving forward." Caleb looked at him. "You've already started." As the sun climbed higher and the square emptied, Caleb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. "I kept this," he said, holding out a folded note. Mason took it, carefully unfolding the paper. It was Amelia's letter, the one from the 10-year-old girl who had forgiven him when he couldn't forgive himself. Sometimes the strongest thing is to be kind and respectful, even when others are not. Mason felt his throat tighten. "I carry mine too," he whispered. "Everywhere I go." They didn't need to say anything else. Not today. As Caleb turned to leave, Mason remained by the gates for a while, letting the breeze tug at his coat. Not long ago, this had been the place where he'd made a mockery of something sacred, but today it had become something else entirely. A place where he finally understood what it meant to stand for something. And in that understanding, he had found not shame, but purpose. In a world that often praises those who speak the loudest, act the fastest, and take center stage, we sometimes forget the quiet power of restraint. The story of Caleb Whitmore reminds us that true strength does not always arrive with noise or force, but with stillness, presence, and dignity. When faced with humiliation, provocation, and public disrespect, Caleb could have responded with anger. He had every reason to. He was spat upon, taunted, mocked. But he chose to pause, to breathe, and to act with discipline rooted in something far deeper than pride. His silence wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. a deliberate act of self-restraint born from experience, service, and the understanding that some moments require not reaction, but reflection. To many older adults, this lesson feels familiar. You've lived through decades of change, conflict, and growth. You know what it means to hold your tongue when it would be easier to speak. You've seen the consequences of impulsive choices and the healing that only time and patience can offer. Caleb's decision to uphold his values, even under direct attack, mirrors the quiet, resilient courage that so many in your generation have demonstrated time and again. In that moment at Buckingham Palace, Caleb didn't just protect the dignity of the uniform. He upheld the dignity of every person who's ever served something greater than themselves: family, country, tradition, or faith. His response teaches us that sometimes the most powerful message is not the one shouted, but the one lived. And what of Mason Langford? The man who delivered the insult, who embodied arrogance and ignorance in equal measure? His journey matters just as much because it shows us that people can change profoundly when they're given the chance to learn and the courage to face themselves. Mason's transformation wasn't forced, it was earned. Through service, humility, and facing the consequences of his actions, he became someone worthy of respect. Not because of his money, but because of his growth. This too is a lesson worth holding on to. It is never too late to change. Whether we are young and foolish, or older and afraid we've made irreversible mistakes, we all have the capacity to turn back, to choose better, and to make amends. Life will give us many opportunities to fall, but also, if we're open, many more to rise. And how we rise defines us more than how we fell. To the older generation, your wisdom is more needed now than ever. In a society that moves fast, that forgets the value of quiet courage and personal integrity, you are the living reminders of what matters most. Your lives are filled with moments where you chose to hold firm, to protect what's right, to lead by example. You know that strength is not in how loudly we speak, but in how deeply we stand for something. So, share those stories. Talk to your children and grandchildren about moments where you could have lashed out, but didn't. Tell them what it means to carry dignity through hardship, to serve with honor even when no one is watching. Remind them that respect isn't something we demand, it's something we live. Caleb's story may have happened in front of tourists and cameras, but the most important battles of character happen quietly, in private, every day. In how we treat strangers, in how we forgive, in how we respond when we are misunderstood or mistreated. In the end, this story isn't just about a guard or a tourist. It's about the choice each of us faces time and time again, to react or to rise, to defend our ego or to preserve our values, to respond with impulse or to lead with integrity. Let us choose the latter, because in that stillness, in that grace under fire, we find the strength that never fades with age, the strength of character. What are your thoughts on this story? Did the ending surprise or move you? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If this story resonated with you and you'd like to experience more powerful and emotional journeys, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support keeps these stories alive and helps us continue sharing voices that deserve to be heard. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.